Thanks so much. I'm going to talk mostly about animals, but since all of my work is about relationships between things, not the things themselves, but the relationship between things, I have to frame those animals in a larger story of other things that I'm doing first. So I'm going to tell you about this kind of revelation I've had this year, actually the last few months, of this third in a trilogy of ambitious serial projects that has just kind of emerged. The first one already mentioned, edible states, focusing on plants and people and food and cities. Animal estates, promoting native urban wildlife architecture. And the third series of projects, which is beginning actually on Monday, its first public presentation, called Domestic Integrities, which is about human interiors, human domestic interiors. And, so plants, animals, and people, basically. Animals were something I was obsessed with when I was little, and I think for many children, animals are a real focus of curiosity. And for some reason, I don't understand why, but as we get older, that falls away, and we're trained to think that animals aren't important, or they're somehow peripheral. And I think kids get it. Kids understand that animals are important. And later we're kind of educated to believe that they aren't, I think. So when I started Animal Estates, I wrote a long manifesto, rambling manifesto about why I was doing this project. That's how I start every project, is just getting all my thoughts down. So I just wanted to read a little excerpt from that. Animals alternately represent a wildness that we are afraid of in ourselves, or a freedom that we would like to recapture. As the human domination of the planet continues, animals are alternately viewed as exotic specimens to be treated as spectacle, cartoon characters that are anthropomorphized, friendly companions to be coddled, objectified resources to be exploited, inconveniences to be tolerated, pests to be eradicated, or anonymous unseen creatures to which we are indifferent. The rest of it's on the website if you want to read it. My early obsession with animals reached its peak when I had a wonderful summer school program in Minneapolis where I grew up, where every summer I could pick a class that I wanted to do. And I guess I was kind of a nerdy kid because I was extremely excited about that. One year I spent the entire summer at the zoo every day for the entire summer. And we were meant to select an animal to research. And I don't know how this came about, but I picked humans. So I was watching the humans watching the animals. That was my research, and especially the snow monkeys. And watching humans watch snow monkeys is amazing. They're much more, the snow monkeys look so dignified, and the humans just look like kind of idiots, I think. To really tell the story of this project, I need to go back and refer to actually a very specific book that inspired me that I read a few years ago. This is a fantasy depiction of Southern California where I live. This is the Sierra Nevada, painted by Albert Bierstadt. This kind of fantastical vision of this sort of idyllic landscape that the European colonists were sending back. This is a picture of that same landscape and the people that were living there. There's a book called Tending the Wild in which Kat Anderson, I believe it was 10 years of research about this particular story of this particular piece of land and the native people living there. That really captured my imagination and kind of described a lot of what I was interested in at that time. And it's really only recently, this was 4 or 5 years ago that I read it maybe, and only recently has it begun to emerge, I think, in the work that I'm doing. But it basically tells the story of the people who were living on a land that, to the Western or to the European eye, seemed lazy. It seemed like here's this idyllic landscape, so bountiful, and people are just living high off the land and not doing much. What they didn't understand is they were entering into a very highly tended landscape, where there was strategic harvesting, there were fires, there was cane being straightened to make baskets, there was all this activity that was invisible to their eye. There's a beautiful account specifically about how they would approach a tree or a bush before they were going to harvest something. When I'm in a grocery store now, I always think of this passage from this book because it talks about this sort of solemn procession towards the tree, paying attention to it. You circle the tree a few times before you'd even think of picking anything. It was a very reverent kind of relationship to where your food was coming from, and it was just this beautiful account. And whenever I just see this sort of frenzy at any sort of food situation, I just think how far we've come and how sad it is. You know, people lined up for hot dogs or something, and just think, oh, this is really depressing. So I describe this situation of these people living connected to a piece of land before gardens, before agriculture, before a word for art, before a word for nature. Because when you have a word for nature, you are separate than what you're looking at. I describe this not because I'm naive enough to think we can return to this sort of particular relationship to the land, but because I think we absolutely positively have to understand this exact relationship to be able to move forward. Because I personally believe we can't move forward with the current model mindset we have in our heads about what our relationship is to wilderness or land. So, for example, the fact that we have a word for nature is problematic. It's a problem. We should not have that word. I propose that we get rid of the word, and that whenever you think you need to use the word, you check yourself and ask yourself why you have to use it. Because it is a very convenient word that puts this great line between us and everything else. Of course, assumption being that we're not that. We're something else separate from it, and of course, we're not. But the word nature lets us pretend that we're not. So let's get rid of that word for starters. I don't know. They didn't have a word and it worked out okay for them. They also didn't have a word for art, which I think is pretty great. And the fact that those two words didn't exist, I think, is fundamental to a lot of work that I'm interested in. So I want to just do a quick overview of these two other projects about plants and human interiors, these other two series of projects, and then talk about, hopefully have time to talk about animal estates in more depth. I live in LA. This is my house for the past 12 years, which has served as kind of a laboratory for first gardening and then having these sort of social activities. This was just this season. I ripped out everything on the roof and I replanted it with natives and edibles. The first series of projects that in the trilogy, Edible Estates, started in 2005, looking at this situation of these two monocultures. This is this. You can't have this sort of monoculture of quote unquote living without this monoculture of growing. And we know that they're both toxic and sick, and what happens when you start to reconcile both of those. Edible Estates is a series of gardens working with families to publicly produce and grow food where they live. Next year the 13th will be planted in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I grew up with the Walker Arts Center. Each one is commissioned by a museum or art institution. Actually, Irene Hoffman commissioned the one in Baltimore. Stacy Switzer commissioned the one in Salina, Kansas, the very first one. They're both in this room. And Stacy especially, I'm so grateful to, this is the book. Here's the house, and we planted in July, but she was really adamant that we do it. At first, I just had this proposal, this idea, and she was very adamant that we had to do it. And I'm so grateful because now it's the foundation of all my work, I think. All my work exists fundamentally as something that is done, not something that is represented. And then my work involves telling the story of these different acts. So I'll just breeze through these. I think the book's in the bookstore maybe, or it's on sale here, but it's a story of the 8 gardens that were planted at that point, and there's a new edition that'll come out next year. So working with families in all kinds of different living situations, in all different kinds of neighborhoods, all kinds of family units, an apartment complex in Austin, Texas. This is the one I worked on with Irene. Clarence Ridgely got in touch about his house in Baltimore, a family in Lakewood, California. And I'm always drawn to, well, I don't know. The good thing about doing talks is you have to figure out stuff. And I think when I was coming over here today, it just kind of dawned on me, thinking specifically about the wild and wilderness, how much my work has been trying to reconcile and make sense of these opposite poles between domesticity and wilderness. And I think for us in Western society today, if you were to think of the antithesis of the domestic, it would be the wild. We think for something to be domestic that is suitable for humans, it can't be wild. They're mutually exclusive. And I think that's what I'm interested in with that first anecdote, that first picture, because their home was the wild. There was this deep, ongoing conversation about where they were. But for us today, for someplace to be domesticated, it must be not wild. And one thing I've been drawn to in all of these gardens slowly and gradually, as you'll see towards the end, is they become more and more wild and as I progressed. This was one with Tate Modern in London, a communal garden. These are all continuing. The most recent one was just planted this spring in Budapest, Hungary, with his family. Okay, my dream of the Edible Estates garden was to plant it in a place where it was illegal. Only later did I realize I wouldn't be the one to get in trouble, it would be the family. And strangely enough, the 12th garden was the illegal one, and it was not in a very conservative, gated community in the US, it was in Budapest, Hungary, in a amazing neighborhood that I became really drawn to, called Veckerle, inspired by Garden City movement, designed and engineered for rural people moving into the city for factory jobs to be able to grow their own food in a familiar environment. So the whole neighborhood was designed for people coming to the city to be able to use their skills. So they were all given 4 fruit trees. Stories tell us that they could pay their rent 4 times over just with the currants that would grow in their land. It became a national heritage site, and in Hungary, there's no tradition of beautiful kitchen gardens. A kitchen garden is an ugly, productive thing. So kitchen gardens are illegal in Veckerle. So we had to ask permission to the mayor to do this, actually. Ridiculous. One of the things that struck me here, too, was the first thing the owners wanted was a bograč, an open fire with a kettle, the classic Hungarian, this classic Hungarian thing, which is center of the garden now, which I think now every garden I do, I want to have that in the middle, someplace not to publicly produce your food, but also to prepare it and eat it. In Rome, Italy last year, on my terrace, that when I was there for a year later, donated to a community center, which is next to Termini, in the middle of the city, this community center, an old factory site that has now become quite wild. And then in Turkey, on the roof, in a hothouse on the roof of a museum, which is really it's kind of a one-off, but it's more like a gardening headquarters for local urban gardeners where we do workshops and things like that. And then most recently, and this connects most to the animal stories coming up, one of the most recent gardens, a Lenape garden of native plants next to the Highline. I worked with the Highline on this. Doing a garden not to feed this families in this public housing, but to do a garden that would show the 27 native plants that the people, the Lenape would have eaten from off the island of Manhattan 400 years ago. We also included Three Sisters mounds. And most of you probably know what that is because I'm sure you're a very sophisticated group here. But it's a mound into which you plant corn, and then the corn shoots up and beans grow up the corn, and then squash. It's conventionally considered this classic Native American planting strategy. When I had a meeting a few weeks ago in Minneapolis about the upcoming work there next year, I talked about that, and a Native American in the room who is a gardener told me something I didn't know, which is in Minnesota, Three Sisters gardens are kind of offensive. It's not native. It's what the white people gave the Native Americans when they eradicated their environment. It's not, those aren't native to Minnesota. It's what they were left with. So in that case, these Three Sisters mounds, which a lot of people promote as this sort of native planting strategy, isn't at all. It's actually quite the opposite. Anyway, one last anecdote about gardening. This video that you saw when you came in, I just finished a few days ago in Liverpool for the garden. I just finished it for the Liverpool Biennial there at a very traumatic site in the city, this park that was built on top of 2 demolished neighborhoods. Slum clearances happened in the 60s where they built 17 modern housing towers. Those towers were then demolished because they didn't work, and then they did a park. That's a park only in name because they couldn't think of what else to do. And it's a park that doesn't work very well. And it's a site of real trauma. You have residents who were relocated elsewhere in the city who go there every day to sit where their kitchen was. It's a crazy place. So I was invited to do something. I did a garden in the middle of the park right here in a bowl-shaped space. Here you can see before and after. So the park looks like this. And what I realized with all the edible estates gardens that I did, I was focused very exclusively on growing food for families publicly, but of course what would happen is when you drove down the street to the garden, you would see this cloud of wildlife, birds and butterflies and bees, and it became a de facto wildlife sanctuary just because of the hostile environment that it's in, like this park. So I've become more and more interested in gardens that introduce native wildlife and become places where animals are also comfortable. I had proposed something for this bowl that was more cultivated, but luckily enough, the person hired by the park to mow and blow, basically, I mean, he does a lot of other things. I met with him in the first day about what I wanted to do, and he said, what about something of native, wild, that we could forage? And he's an expert, this guy. He's been obsessed with foraging since he was little. So that was the real point of entry to the project, this great stroke of luck that someone like that was there. So we started the project on the planting last May with this kind of ceremonial excavation with a local archaeologist to excavate the site of the church at the entry to the spiral that I planted. It was exposed for about 2 hours. And during that time, families came with their pictures of them at the church, getting married, baptized, whatever. And then all the bricks we pulled out were used to line this spiral, which I called the foraging spiral. And I worked with James Corner, who did the High Line on this. He's doing a long-term master plan. I'm doing these short-term things. So he had this great idea. The first act of the project would be to stop mowing. We planted something. There's James, the gardener. We planted something, but the first thing we did was say, stop mowing, stop mowing. So this meadow started to grow up as the foraging spiral did. And you can see the entire landscape changed in just a few months' time. And of course, all this wildlife and people started to be drawn in. But the great act of the project is just to invite people to come in off the street and into a circle and conversation in the park. And then this past weekend, we had a geodesic dome inserted in the center of the spiral that was a site for conversations with local residents about the future of their park. Domestic Integrities is the new series, which I still don't know how to talk about because it's just starting, but I'll just read this little blurb. Surveys local and seasonal patterns and rituals of interior domestic landscapes, the way we use what we resourcefully find around us to artfully make ourselves at home. Turns its attention inwards to the interior environments of humans and the ways in which local resources are digested into their homes. So the great question for me after Edible Estates was, now that we've initiated this activity of growing things publicly in the city, I'm interested in cycles, in stories of how things flow through our lives and through a garden, through a house, through a landscape. So Domestic Integrities is inspired by a theory, in part, by a theory by Buckminster Fuller, which describes the separation between, or the distinction between a physical thing and its material being. It's what it is and what its matter is. So a great example is your body. All of the cells are completely replaced every 7 years. That is, if I haven't seen you for 7 years, I'm encountering a different physical entity that has different cells. So, who are you? You are something that has material flowing through you. He also describes it as a knot. So if you can imagine a knot and a piece of rope that you slide to string, what is the knot? So it's something I've been inspired by since very early in my work, this idea of holding on to physical material matter very lightly, so that I pay attention to it when it flows through, I let it do what it needs to do, and then I let it go. The material is a vehicle, it's not something to be fetishized or held on to, which is something I feel very strongly with about art. for me, the way I treat material in my art. It's something that's important and I value it, but I let it go and it passes through. And I'm looking at this the way a house works, the way material, physical material flows through a house, from the environment through the house. So I did early tests on rugs, braiding rugs at my house, using old clothes and textiles and crochet. Well, then I started to crochet them because braiding, I don't know if you guys have done this, but it's a pain in the ass to stitch them together. And there's something beautiful about crocheting where it's this one line of fabric that ties into itself. So there's, the rug is the stage of the project. I'll describe it very briefly, upon which things are presented every day that are coming from outside. Fresh fruit harvest, cut flowers, a local recipe, preserved berries, whatever. This project has its, will open in the galleries at MoMA on Monday. I planted a garden in the MoMA courtyard this spring with a friend who has a big urban farm in Brooklyn. They've been taking care of it all summer, and we've been harvesting things, drying things, preserving things, and those things will then be presented on the rug in the gallery. These are pictures more recently. This is the gallery we'll go into. You can see the rug, which will be 18 feet. It's now 12 feet there, so I have to get busy once I get there tomorrow and start getting as many people as I can there to crochet it up to 18 feet, which is going to take a while. But this rug, you take your shoes off, you get on the rug, you have some bread, you try some jam, you see what fruit came off the trees that day. And the project, in essence, is paying attention to where we are and what season it is and what time it is. So I've become extremely sensitive to rooms, interiors. I can go into a room now and say, just by being in this room, can I tell where in the world I am? Just by being in this room, can I tell what time of year it is? Does anybody care? Does anyone who is responsible for this room really care? Really, beyond what they have to about the roof not falling in or whatever. And this idea of, well, was someone outside today, and did they come inside and bring something with them? So it's this story of how the exterior is digested into the interior and then going back and flowing back into the landscape again. So here are the farmers harvesting the cucumbers and whatever was coming out. I think they had some whitefly problems. I'm going to buzz through these, la, la, la. These are domestic integrities, I call them. This was in London where we first started out. So there's 2 rugs right now. There's one in the US, there's one in Europe, and as they travel, they get more rings and they get bigger. So the one in New York will get up to 18 feet, and then it'll go to LA at the Hammer, where it will get a little bigger, and then it'll get to maybe 30 feet at the Walker Art Center next year. The animal-related story I wanted to finish this off with in domestic integrities was the European rug, which has traveled to about 6 cities now and is now on a farm in Abruzzo in Italy for a year, where they produce art projects. And this wonderful guy who runs this space says, we have these sheep. Abruzzo is famous for its sheep. We can get all their wool because the market's bottomed out for some reason. So we have 100 kilos of wool from these exact sheep that I now have. So we drove around for a day looking for a nice stream to wash all the wool by hand. We've only washed about 10% of it. It's a lot of hard work. And then I'm dyeing it with local plants that come into season. I'll be going there regularly through a year, kind of developing this project there. I'm knitting, spinning it, knitting it, and then we're also felting it into cords, rolling it, that are then being crocheted into the rug. And this rug has come from Vienna, Budapest, and London, where it's been crocheted with, in London we did lost and found clothes from the Haeg Gallery, and then it's gonna be this hand felted wool from Abruzzo into the next ring. So there's, the rug kind of tells this story of where it's been in some way. And the sheep, you can't, the smell of these sheep, you can't get away from it once you get to that Abruzzo ring of the rug. So this is the first test I have. It's not been publicly presented yet. The first chance I get will really be tomorrow when I get to New York and see the rug, and we've got all this stuff there. So that's a circular thing I planted. All right. So Animal Estate started in 2008. And it really grew out of my background as an architect. My training is and early obsessions as a youth are very much architecture. With a capital A, I had a very conventional architectural education. I was obsessed with architecture from a young age. My work now for the last few years has migrated away from buildings and to everything but buildings, really. But I still think of myself as using those skills and tools and ways of looking at the world that are unique to architecture, and that an architect can show up to a place, receive a brief or a program or some sort of situation, and reconcile all these kind of complex situations into a very particular response that takes into account a whole spectrum of challenges, from the cultural to the scientific, to the geographic, to the social. And I think there's also something I'm interested in about the model of the artist in the world that's different from the way an architect works. An architect has to wait for people with money to invite them to solve the problems that they're interested in solving. The architect can kind of sneak in their agenda, and hopefully if you get far enough along, your agenda gets well enough known so people are seeking that out. But still, you're dependent on people with money. And I was interested in developing my work in a way where I was free to be in charge of my work and what I wanted to look at and explore. And I think I'm really reckless with my work in the sense that I feel like I give myself latitude to go to wherever I'm drawn, whether I'm qualified or not. I'm an amateur gardener. I've never really studied animals. I come to the work as someone who goes deep into curiosities and kind of passions that I go through, and the work is a way to channel that and work with other people who are more skilled than I am. So especially in particular, Animal Estates is predicated upon deep collaborations with local people who know what's going on in those cities. So Animal Estates really is an architectural project where the clients happen to be animals. And I think of it very clearly like that. Expanding their idea of who are the clients in our cities, who are our cities for, and it's very specifically an urban project. This project does not make sense in the quote-unquote wild. It's an urban project. So each city that I'm invited to do the project, or where I do the project, is starts with a very specific first act, which is to find out who are the experts on native urban wildlife here. I identify them and we work together on the project. And usually I can do that in a few days. I find one and they know each other, so I find all of them right away. I read an article about Eric Sanderson when I was preparing this project, who did the Mannahatta project. He spent 10 years developing a computer system. I like that I'm talking to a techie group because you probably know more about this than I do. But he developed a system where he could input all the data he knew about what Manhattan looked like at 2 p.m., I think that was the time, September 10th, 1609. Everything, insects, animals, rocks, rivers, lakes, streams, fields, forests, everything into this, and he could move it around and take a picture anywhere in Manhattan at that time, which is the moment he believes Henry Hudson, the first white man, set foot on the island. So you'll see smoke coming up where the Lenape outcamps were. We know that there were about 400 or 500 of them at the time, and he took this picture for me of the location of the first edition of Animal Estates at the Whitney Museum to identify this spot, the corner of 75th and Madison, which is where the Whitney is now. He identified all of the animals he knows for absolute sure who lived at that corner 400 years ago, 2 p.m., whatever. There were beavers, and beavers create habitat for other animals. There were also eagles, which is this national federal symbol. So I was interested in both of those animals as kind of these beginning points of dialogue about the project, but most of my project is focused exclusively on this kind of laundry list in a way. Animals who used to live in the city, who don't anymore, who need architecture, who need an infrastructure that doesn't exist anymore because their infrastructure has been removed, who will move into an infrastructure that humans can make for them. Okay, so it has to satisfy all those things. Oh, one more, that humans might want to cohabitate with. That's maybe important. So those are the requirements for the project. So every city I go to, I work with the experts and we make a list of those animals, and it's either 5 or 7 or 12. And in New York, we had 12 animals we were working with. And then we make prototypes, and a lot of times I'm not getting all crazy designing wacky prototypes that look cool. I'm working with even models that exist online of things that have been developed over time that seem to work, and they're cheap and simple. So I want to develop prototypes that anyone can make at home to promote the idea that anyone should be able to host or accommodate these creatures on their property and promote a layer of architecture that could be grafted over the city. So the first edition was used as almost this model home display of 12 prototypes that New Yorkers could check out and see, like, okay, which animals do I want at my house? And also, if you're familiar with Marcel Breuer's Whitney Museum, it has a sculpture court, which looks like that first picture I showed you of the monkey habitat. It looks like a zoo display, which was very convenient. So we had bronze plaques made identifying all of the animals and their habitats. These are white gourds for the purple martins. This is a kind of log made out of a sonotube for bobcat. This is the eagle's nest. 10-foot diameter, can weigh up to 2 tons, which is a fascinating structure. Eagles return to it year after year and keep adding more layers. It has a beautiful geometry to it. They start out with a triangle of branches, and they keep triangulating it and twisting it. So like the geodesic dome, it has all of this structural integrity because of those triangles. I made a beaver pond, of course. And then a lot of the animals that we know were at that site were there because of the beavers. This is a very kind of brutalist, Marcel Breuer-inspired beaver lodge with a duck estate, wood duck estate. And these are the flags with the beaver. The state flag is the beaver, and the national flag, of course, is the eagle. And I was also interested in the industriousness of the beaver and the power of the eagle. But for this Whitney Biennial, there was an eagle's nest floating over the canopy as you entered in. And this was in the middle of a few things: some war activity, and also an economic meltdown. And I was interested in this eagle as a symbol of national power with these talons that are always displayed. And in the US, we think of the eagle as this powerful figure, and it's a bird of prey. And we talk about right-wing warmongering politicians as hawkish or whatever. But also we know, if you look at the history of environmentalism in the 20th century, that Silent Spring is the story of this reckoning of DDT and its effect on our wildlife, specifically the bald eagle and the effect it had on its eggs. So we can see this story played out, this powerful eagle symbolizing our national power that at the same time is the first dramatic, visible evidence of our industrial, polluting activity on the wildlife around us. So I thought that nest was an appropriate thing to be walking under. And my intention of this installation was that it disappear in a way, that it wasn't a conventional sculpture court installation that was about spectacle. It was something that you didn't even know was there, maybe. I stood in line a couple of times going in or waiting out there or something, and I overheard these ladies talking like, I don't know what this is. Some local group has done this. It's not art. It's not part of the show. It's something else. There'll be art there for the next show probably, but this isn't art. And I was so happy that I was actually able to do an installation in front of a museum during a biennial that people were convinced was not art. I thought that was awesome, because my whole relationship to what we might call the art world is that the art world is a platform from which work radiates into the world. It is not the destination of the work. It is the source of the work. And I think that's such an important distinction, especially for young people that I work with when I'm meeting with students. When you're a young artist and you want to make it, you just want to get in. You want to get in there and be a part of that. And that's beautiful, and we all want that dialogue, and we all want that community. But once you're in it, you have to get out, and you have to at some point, share with what's going, make work that engages a dialogue beyond people who are looking for art even, let's say. So I'm really interested in creating work that can enter into a public dialogue and extend out even to the extreme that people could have a primary experience with it, where their immediate experience is not framed by art first. So that line of defense you kind of get rid of. If people have this message that this is contemporary art first before they have the experience with the work is mediated by that. And if you can make work that doesn't have that first, then something happens which I think is interesting, I think. The work can also exist in a museum and exist in a different dialogue, but I like to have all of those. And it was very important for me that this work be at the threshold of the museum, created for people on the sidewalk, not for people in the museum itself. The other thing that was a revelation about this project, I think, was this assumption that, this seems like a save the world, up with people or up with the animals. Everything's going to be okay if we can just make homes for animals in the city kind of project. But I don't think it is. I think it's both hopeful and tragic at the same time in a way. If you look at it, this installation, on one hand you could think, great, homes for animals. I don't know, I have to think people's first reaction is going to be like, this is meant to be some sort of solution to a problem and everything's going to be great if we all just do this. But look at what this is. I think it's kind of tragic if you look at this as an approximation of what used to be there. And I think when I did this project, I had this realization that what I was really interested in, hopefully, was an experience with work that could have you feel simultaneously, simultaneously feel both doom and hope at the same time. And that if you didn't simultaneously feel both at the same time, it wasn't honest. Because I think I experienced work that is about, we're all screwed, so let's just have a good time, or everything's going to be great if we just do this and up with people, save the planet. And we all feel it in our bones that this is not true. We feel it like we want to go there because it's fun to believe we're all screwed, and then we can just forget about that and have fun. And we want to believe we're all going to be fine if we just do this, but we both know neither is true completely, I think. And I don't know if it's possible to make work that says both at the same time, even if you can't even articulate it. I think that is true. I think that's something we need to experience or understand and move forward in whatever way we choose to. So this is a wall of bees, solitary bees. All of these have been donated to different locations since this. Most of the homes have been donated to a park in northern Manhattan. This one is at Alice Waters Edible Schoolyard in Brooklyn, which was hard actually to get the parents to agree to have the wall of bees with their kids in the garden. And I had to go through all this stuff to explain these are solitary bees. They're not protecting their hive or anything, but that was seen as very threatening, which I can imagine it would be, but I don't know if it's there yet, actually. These are little homes. This is Swindler Park in northern Manhattan where they've been installed. Later, I got pictures showing squash, which was so appropriate because these are gourds, dried gourds, so it's making more squash. These are the squirrels. So what I just showed you was only a small part of the project. That was just the physical installation. The whole other part of the project involved activity that unfolded through the 3 months or whatever it is of the show. So every week I invited a different person to come and do something about one of the animals. And that could be a talk about possums. It could be my friend who's a folk singer sang songs about the flying squirrel. But all of the activity was around those animals that used to live where you were standing at that moment. And it was very important to have that reckoning where you could say, these animals were here, these animals were here, If you want to see this video online of Kate Hardy, she's a performance artist in New York, it's pretty great. I didn't know what she was going to do. She came as the bobcat, kicked off the Animal Estates reality show doing her elimination speech, where she kind of trash talks the rest of the 11 animals. And then the LA Urban Rangers, which is a great collective in LA, gave a guided tour of some of the sites. Turtles came in. I've become really interested in dance and movement as a part of my work, and I've worked especially in New York with a lot of different dancers. So I invited 12 of them to write scores of movement inspired by the animals, and they performed those movements silently through the museum for most of the run of the show, or just at the very beginning, actually, at the strata at which those animals used to live on the land. So the eagles at the top and the turtles in the bookstore. And then we did these kind of homoerotic the shoot of this male model striking all these poses with the score of movement written on the back of the postcard, and these were for sale in the bookstore. And I like, you know, the project has, I think projects like this can deteriorate into this sort of earnest, sort of science-y or save the world sort of, even, you know, just like having a lack of humor. But for me, the work has to fulfill, it has to, I don't know, with each project I do, there's something at the center that is, yeah, the bobcat. There's something at the center of the work that is alive and changing and hard to hold on to. It's a tomato plant, or it's an animal, or it's an interior arrangement, or it's a school or whatever. And it's important to me that the center of the work is worthless, or it has no value. It can't hold value. And not only is it worthless, it's priceless. It's beyond monetary value, you know? So then my work is involved with circling around that thing and telling its story and communicating it and working with local residents to kind of, even at times almost have a consciousness raising about it. Like, how can we circle around this thing in as many different points of view as possible so that Kate Hardy could come as the bobcat and Eric Sanderson, the scientist, could come and tell his story. I like all of those sides. Anyway, so it's important to me that the project be broadcast in as many media as possible, which I think maybe is the most appropriate thing I could say to this particular audience, because I'm not a particular techie person, but I use email, my online archive of my work, video, publications, museum installations, books, as ways of disseminating the work, and they're all equally valuable or important. None of them is really privileged one over the other. So the work exists primarily as the thought that manifests in various media in different ways. Another part of the project was at the Park Avenue Armory, where all 12 dancers were together performing these scores. The most architectural edition of the project happened in Portland, where the local experts, all of them, I mean, I met, what was her, Charlotte. Charlotte was the first one I met. And then she said, well, do you know Bob? And I met Bob, and then they told me about Steve. And then really within 24 hours, I knew all of them, and that was it. I knew what was going on in Portland in a matter of, you know, a couple of days being in touch with them. And they all said, do you know about the snag? Do you know about the snag? You have to do the snag. And I didn't know what a snag was, which is a dead tree. And dead trees host up to 50% of the wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. And when a tree dies, its function does not end. It becomes even more valuable in a way. So what we view with the human eye as waste, in our very primitive human minds, as waste, something to get discarded before the lawsuits begin, something that has no value that you know, chop up for parts and get rid of, in the story of a forest has a real valuable role to play, even once sap has stopped, you know, going through its veins or whatever. So in the dead tree, it becomes architecture. You know, woodpeckers make holes, squirrels move in, beetles do their work, all kinds of animals make their homes in this thing, and in an urban environment where trees that are dead are removed right away, 50% of the native wildlife no longer has homes. So for a progressive city like Portland, I love this idea of raising the bar for them and saying, listen, if you're going to do what you need to do, you have to build a snag on your property. You have to do this. So the idea was to create a prototype of what an architectural man-made snag might be. I designed mine based on 7 species we identified, and then made this poster that we put around. promoting this idea that everyone could submit their own designs for a snag, what they would want to do. We displayed those in the gallery with mine. Students, different local college programs assigned it as a project. So the fantasy was the entire city of Portland could be forested with these snags that people were building in their homes. So maybe there wouldn't be these dead trees, but there would be these architectural trees. So in this case, you can see the 7 species. Bats on the south-facing black louvers, hibernaculum for snakes, beetles under the logs, bees in the base, and then the whole thing is a hollow chimney for swifts to nest in through the top. All right, I want to finish these up quickly. It's now in the Presidio in San Francisco, the Netherlands. I'm going to actually skip this because I want to go to the very end. Yeah. All right, so I want to tell you about the last edition of Animal Estates, and then maybe we have some time for questions. In London, I was invited by Arup Associates, the global engineering firm, who started really with the Opera Hall in Sydney and have offices in 100 cities around the world. A very sophisticated engineering company that does the biggest, most complicated structures in the world. They're usually involved. I was invited to do something in their ground floor gallery space, Animal Estates, so I decided to make a new department of Arup. That would be housed in the gallery and focus on these particular species in London. And then worked with a graphic designer friend there on this series of posters. Arup looks like this. When you come in, it's a very slick situation. So for my new department of Arup, we made an identical one-to-one reproduction of their slick entry for our new department, called Animal Estates London HQ Urban Wildlife Client Services. So when a client came into Arup, they had to decide, were they there for humans or were they there for animals? And then they could go from one desk to another. And I had a full-time director there who was at the front desk receiving people the whole time. We built it out of, the way an animal makes a nest. Whatever junk we found around is what we built it out of. Then once you go in, this was the director. Once you go in, we had a combination of standard issue Arup office cubicle furniture for 8 interns working on the 8 animal clients and a conference table, but we also had taxidermy animals that we were working with. We had a map of the city. We had a kind of amphitheater area for presentations. We had prototypes of the different things we were promoting in the City of London. And then we had workstations for the interns in London who were coming in every day to research the animals. And then a series of events and activities which were represented each week with these posters you could take home. So, I don't know, one story I just wanted to go back to here, one anecdote before I finish and go to questions is, one, there's 2 things I learned maybe as I was traveling, especially with someone as a background as an architect, is that our cities are too neat. They're not messy enough. There's not enough places for animals to make their homes. Our lawns, our landscapes are too manicured. They're too clean. Animals like piles of branches. They like leaf litter. They like piles of stuff that we remove. And once you're open to that, you're open to a certain kind of beauty that we're not comfortable with yet. Which gets back to those first pictures I showed you, which gets back to these ideas of domesticity versus the wild. And can we reconcile making ourselves at home in something more wild and less dominated, let's say. The other thing is our architecture is too hermetically sealed. In old buildings, they would have terracotta tiles that animals could actually move into. New buildings that replace those are these tight membranes, and there's no place for animals to get in. So it just exacerbates the problem that already exists in the landscape. So all these things that we want to take care of, like fixing our buildings so they don't have holes and get rid of litter, like like when people think of maintaining property, that's mostly what they're concerned with, is actually in direct opposition to this. So the last thing I just wanted to show you, the first picture I showed you was the eagle's nest in New York, and it's the only thing I've ever sold as an artist in my entire life, which was independently a collector in Santa Fe got in touch with me and offered to buy it. And he bought the eagle's nest, and it is now permanently situated on a 30-foot post in Santa Fe, where eagles are maybe moving in. So that's my little tenuous connection to New Mexico that I thought I would leave you with. But I'll leave it at that and open it up to any questions if we have time. Thanks.
Wireless microphone, I guess it's working, and I'd like to turn over moderating the questions to my colleague Catherine Harris in the UNM Art and Ecology program, who is the organizer of the Transspecies Habitat subtheme. So,
thank you, and thank you so much, Fritz. We met only briefly at the Art and Environment Conference, and we bonded over the plum tree that was in the backyard on the way to the co-op, so that we could do a little foraging.
Foraging.
Anyway, so I'm very grateful that you were able to come. So questions? Does anybody want to? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if your process developing these projects differs when you work internationally as opposed to when you work here in America?
It depends on the project. It depends on the circumstances. Hungary was the only city I've worked in where I couldn't speak the language, so that was a challenge. That was the most obvious challenge. I don't know. I think, you know, for example, I don't think it's international versus domestic, because I think New York's more like London than it is like LA, for example. But I think the basic premise of a lot of the work is taking a very global thought and applying it in very particular ways locally. And in that way, that's how I kind of rationalize this sort of work that travels. Because for me to show up in Liverpool and pretend I know what's going on there and can solve problems is ridiculous. But I do think what's helpful when someone's coming in, especially in a contentious place like that, is I come in with no stake in anything. I'm not part of one side or the other. And I can come in and maybe see things that people living there don't see, and I can be part outside of some particular contentious dialogue that might exist, and I can come in seeing what they might think as uniquely local and see that, no, that's part of actually a global, see what's local and what is global. Do you know what I mean? I can see, you know, working in Detroit this term, I can see actually a lot of things happening here are quite similar to what's happening in Detroit. And by paying attention to those global patterns, we can actually understand how to deal with what's happening with what we are, and then at the same time truly appreciate what is unique to this place. Like distinguish, because I think that's important, because we do have both. There are things that are unique to the place, but there's also patterns that are global. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was curious if there's any plan to follow up. You're basically presenting kind of like a real estate company, presenting these models of homes, it seems, but as far as like the follow-up or the sales department, the actual, I mean, I guess you have a suggestion of that, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but do you see any follow-up stage to these works, the idea that these are actually eventually suited to clients in some way, and kind of a flowering of that as a business?
I think that's a really important central question of the process of the project, and I don't even know quite how to answer it except to say that it's not a commercial project and it's not an advocacy project, and it poses as them when it needs to, you know? And I like posing as those things when I need to, but it isn't either one of those things. It enters into the central conundrums and challenges and problems. So when I'm doing the gardens, I'm not looking to avoid the problems that a commercial or advocacy kind of project would be doing. I'm looking for them. And whenever there's resistance, for me, that's the project, you know? So if someone says, I don't want this animal with me around, like, that's crazy. I want to know why, and I want to look at that. That's what I'm drawn to. I'm not trying to get around it. I'm trying to go for that. You know? So, and when I'm planting a garden and people say, I'm not going to grow food here, there's really bad soil and air, I'm not going to say, oh, okay, well, let's figure a way around that. You're right, let's try to do this. I want to go, that's the project. That is the project. So when someone says that, it's a reckoning moment in the project, and we say, yes, the soil is polluted and the air is polluted. So either you say, we're not going to grow food here, oh, well, that's too bad, or you say, you know, moment of reckoning, and then that is a critical moment of the project, in a way, you know? So I don't know how better to describe it except to say that the project exists. There's other people who can do a better job than me of actually getting people to build these things on their land for real. This project exists as an early kind of provocation in that direction, which is also using it as a staging ground for other examinations about how we're living and about our basic relationship to each other and where we live. If that makes sense? I hope it's not too much of a cop-out.
Can I ask a question to sort of follow up on that? Which is just, I guess, in a sense, thinking about this as the possible seeds for a whole network as opposed to sort of the singular sort of sculptural, so that in a sense, like your observation about tiles and how they might have functioned once as being nesting possibilities for birds, the idea of actually being able to redesign how we interact with our environment, how we allow, say, rivers to actually run under our houses, and thus to move meanders through, or that we might maybe posit a way in which architecture itself or urban design itself could actually plan for habitat to be maximized for both species, in a sense. And I guess that's where it sometimes seems like you're sort of pointing in this space where we could actually do a much different thing than we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in formalizing it, giving it a name, giving it a visibility and a sort of sense of identity is something that is should be a priority, I suppose. And you know, architects the last few years have been doing really sophisticated, amazing work with this exactly, figuring out ways to introduce wildlife into the buildings that they're otherwise hired to make, you know, just for people. So, anyone else?
Hi, having watched a program last night called Mother Nature Serial Killer, I'm interested in
I love it.
In your
Mother Nature Serial Killer
perspective on the linguistic and semiotic expressions that people use to talk about nature, and whether it's part of the methodology or the strategy for these works to address those things in the relationships you form with people as they experience the work.
I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but one thing I think about a lot is especially doing these projects with edible estates, and this one, is how in very short order our whole focus and agenda as a species has turned 180 degrees in a very short time, from needing to conserve as many calories as possible in a foraging situation like this, to the opposite. From trying to protect ourselves from real danger from being eaten by an animal, to eradicating all those same animals with our urbanization. So all our motivation is still fear of wildlife and maximizing calories, and yet what we really need is quite the opposite now. Like our whole makeup and motivation as species needs to change 180 degrees, but we're not, and we're aware of that, but we're not equipped to do it yet. So a lot of that how to talk to people about this gets at that central core fear of wildlife, which we should rightly be afraid of. So for example, I can say Animal Estates Project, I've never had, well, I can maybe count on one hand the number of first-hand contacts I've had with animals during this project. So the project is not about me getting down with animals, having close interactions with them. It's about extending a possibility out there and them coming to it or not. It's not like a zoo where you get them and put them in, which curators ask me sometime when they start the project. So like, when are we going to get the animals? You know, it's about an invitation. It's a creative situation that's inviting to them. So it's a relationship with animals that is very particular. And getting at those fears is central, I think, you know, to the project, because that's the central experience of the project is, do you want to live with the snake? Do you want a snake in your front yard? If not, why? You know, it's just, that central thought is the beginning of the project. There's some animals, it's like, yeah, I want that animal around, great. And there's other animals you start to think, especially I mean, of course, bats and bees have become really superstar animals in terms of this, I think. There's a lot of dialogue around them in particular. Animals that are threatening, that we're now understanding, of course, how important they are, and they get really interesting when you understand them.